this second tutorial in Module 8, you will be reading chapters 3, 4, and 5 in One Bible, Many Versions. Chapter 3 talks about the ideal versus the real. So one of the assignments that I want you to do for this tutorial is give 3 examples where a literal Bible translation chose to use a rendering that is outside of their ideal range. And as you read chapter 3, you'll understand just what that means. Chapter 4 talks about words in Scripture and the fact that any given word might be translated several different ways in various contexts. So, for example, the word logos is translated book in Acts chapter 1, verse 1 in the ESV. And the same Greek word is translated statement in another place because it's really referring to a phrase rather than just a single word. But then in another place and in some other places, it is actually translated word or words because that's specifically what it means. So I want you to use a concordance or an interlinear translation along with a lexicon of either Hebrew or Greek. It can be examples from the Old Testament or the New Testament where a single word is translated differently in various contexts. And I want you to give just a brief explanation of why the translators chose to translate it slightly differently, similar to the explanations that are given for these 3 examples of the word logos. Most of our English versions have footnotes noting various aspects of translation that the considerations that the translators had to take into account as they were translating. The next assignment that I want you to do is I want you to look at footnotes in an English version, and I don't want you to find footnotes that talk about manuscript differences where perhaps it says some manuscripts say this slightly differently. Those are not the kinds of footnotes that I'm talking about. I'm talking about footnotes where perhaps the translators are acknowledging that they could have translated more literally. For example, in the NASB, in the New American Standard Bible, if they are acknowledging that there is a more literal rendering that they chose not to use, they'll write lit, and then they'll give that literal rendering. Or in some other versions, they might say Greek, and then give a more literal rendering, or Hebrew and give a more literal rendering. So I want you to find some examples, 5 examples actually, 5 examples where the translators of one of our English versions chose not to translate as literally as they could have, and I want you to look at those examples and explain why they chose not to translate literally in that particular case. Now, the answers to those questions you will find in chapter 5, where it explains the 4 main reasons that translators will often step away from literalness and translate more freely, even the translations that generally tend to be more literal.